good evening, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you on behalf of ReNew Foundation to this evening's webinar on Rhetoric to Action, Ensuring a Successful COP26. The title itself is quite self-explanatory, and its timing, just a fortnight away from what is shaping up to be a supercritical summit at Glasgow, makes the session even more relevant. 6 years ago, the Paris Agreement sowed seeds of hope by putting forth a blueprint for decarbonisation. But progress since then has been less than satisfactory, with countries not living up to their pledges or sufficiently raising their climate ambitions. Currently, policies in place are projected to put the world on course for a 2.9 degrees centigrade temperature rise by 21,000. Latest studies show emissions need to drop by half by 2030 and reach net zero by mid-century to limit the temperature rise caused by global warming to well below 2 degrees and ideally 1.5. Now for some jarring facts. 2020 was among the hottest 3 years on record. The past decade was the hottest in human history. Ocean heat is at record levels. This year in the Arctic, temperatures were more than 3 degrees above average and over 5 degrees higher in northern Siberia. Without climate action and without effective climate action, extreme weather incidents will grow in frequency in the coming years. Much like COVID, climate change has scant respect for national boundaries. Every nation will feel or is already feeling its impact, as is highlighted by the above examples I just shared with all of you. This has made the forthcoming COP26 at Glasgow, I hope you'll all agree, more critical than ever before. We cannot afford a stalemate like COP25 in Madrid, which was underlined by lack of ambition and a plethora of unresolved issues. It's time to take a stand. It's time to take tough decisions. It's time for intentions to turn into actions for the sake of our planet, for our future generations. We all know COP26 must be an unmitigated success. We don't really have a choice. And I'm sure all of you will agree with that. Over the course of the next hour in this webinar, I seek to get answers from this esteemed set of panelists on the trillion-dollar question or even more, which is how can we ensure that COP26 helps us to take a step forward towards mitigating the climate crisis. So helps us to take forward, and we must mitigate the climate crisis. Fortunately, we could not have asked for a better set of experts than we have with us today. We have with us, they need no introduction, but for the sake of the audience, I will briefly introduce Anita George, who is EVP Strategic Partnerships at CDPQ, a global investment management firm. Anita has prior experience of working with the World Bank, IFC, and carries over 4 decades of rich experience in climate finance and sustainable infrastructure. It's such an honor to have a woman with your experience on this panel today. Thank you so much for joining us, Anita. I also have Mr. Shalabh Tandon, Head of South Asia Operations and Climate Finance at IFC. He has over 2 decades of experience as an investment and development banking professional, covering a range of industries, including power, renewables, telecom, IT, oil and gas, manufacturing, and many other sectors. Very happy to have you with us, Shalabh. And you definitely add, as we were discussing before we started, to the diversity on this panel, the kind of diversity which we want to see going forward. Thank you so much for joining us. I am delighted to have Kanika with us, who is currently a program manager at Sustainable Energy for All UN Energy. In her current role, she advances the twin objectives of energy access and energy transition at scale. She has over a decade of experience in clean energy transition policy and has worked extensively on mobilizing clean energy finance for emerging economies. Prior to SE for All, she was known to many of us as a very familiar voice at CEW. Thanks for joining us from New York, Kanika. I know it's it's early in the morning, your time, so thanks for making it. We also have Ms. Jyoti Mukul, editor, energy and infrastructure at Business Standard, one of India's premier dailies. Jyoti has rich insights and knowledge about climate change, energy transition, and particularly the India story. I look forward to listening to some of these stories today, Jyoti. Thanks for joining us. Finally, I would like to welcome Gauri, who is the Executive Director in IHS Markit's Energy Transition and Clean Tech Global Consulting Team. She has 23 years of experience in energy, applied economics, finance, with particular focus on ESG. So as you can see, quite a power-packed lineup, and I shouldn't be talking anymore and just shooting my questions out. So I'd like to start on a positive note with Anita. So while it is easy, Anita, to critique the lack of momentum in the climate movement, there has been some positive development as well, like the increasing adoption of clean energy, investors factoring in ESG considerations, the return of US to the Paris Agreement, and many other such positive developments over the last year and couple of years. Do you think that climate action is finally gathering the desired pace? And does this give us hope that the Glasgow meet will end up achieving much more than previous editions?
Thank you, Vaishali, and thank you again for inviting me here. It's great to be here with all my fellow panelists. I think that there has been a lot of momentum, and based on where I sit as part of a long-term institutional investors, definitely in terms of capital and the objectives of long-term institutional capitals, there's been, I would say, like a roaring and resounding commitment towards working towards climate-friendly investments and mitigating climate change. Where I think the urgency and the importance of doing even more comes into play is precisely, Vaishali, for the facts that you laid out right in the beginning, that there is so much more to be done. And I think that's really the critical question for all of us in our respective fields, is to ask ourselves, okay, we are doing a lot more compared to even 5 years ago, but is that good enough? Is that really going to get us where we want to?
Yeah, Anita, no, I think that's a very good point. And it's a little bit like our sector. The more you do, the less it is, because the opportunities keep growing. Every step you take, there's an ocean of opportunities staring at you. So, and that's good news, because it's a good area, and there is much to be done. And the good news is that there are many, many more getting engaged from hard to abate and various other critical sectors. So absolutely. Shalabh, if I could come to you, you would agree that a major roadblock in accelerating climate action has been the failure of the developed nations to fulfill their promise of annual support of about $100 billion to the global south. Given your wide experience, what factors do you believe will accelerate this fund flow? And what, in your view, can mainstream climate finance even more? As Anita mentioned, that more needs to be done. And so without financing, I guess more cannot be done. So would love to hear your views on that.
Thanks, Vaishali. And again, thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be the diversity element in the panel, as you were mentioning earlier. On a more serious note, I think without getting into the geopolitics of the developed nations providing more aid to the developing nations, from where I see it and from where we have financed many projects related to climate, I think the main thing is how do we catalyze and mobilize more and more capital for a number of areas, and not just renewable energy, but many areas beyond energy. As you may have seen recently, the World Bank Group president unilaterally announced and said that, announced a target for all of us within IFC and within the World Bank, that in the next 5 years, 35% of all our investments will be climate focused. Starting July 1st, 2023, 85% of all our new investments will be Paris aligned, And from July 1, 2025, 100% of all our investment will be Paris aligned. So that's an ambitious target. And what we hope is that this will have some ripple effect on other multilateral institutions, other institutional investors, but more importantly, banks and financial institutions in the emerging economies. As you know, climate is a scale problem. No one institution or government can solve it. We need collective action. And therefore, one of the roles that World Bank Group wants to play is to catalyze, is to be an honest broker in many stakeholder discussions and to push this agenda along. We have also identified, which is nothing new, but 5 key areas where more mainstreaming is required for action. Energy, obviously, is the main one. But apart from that, we need action on agriculture, water and land mixes, on the cities, on the transportation agenda, on the circular economy, and finally the manufacturing. And one of the hardest nuts to crack would be large-scale manufacturing companies which are dependent on fossil fuel, and we want them to decarbonize. And that's where a lot of this aid that you are talking about, $100 billion from developed countries, might be required. And not just aid, even new technologies like carbon capture and storage, green hydrogen, and so on, may be required to actually make sure that this decarbonization happens. I think I can go on, but let me stop here for now. And over to you again.
Thanks, Shalabh, and absolutely very well said. It's institutions such as the World Bank and IFC which will show the way to other organizations. And we had a French delegation over at ReNew today, and they were citing examples of the good work which is being done by IFC and the World Bank, which is an example for them to follow. So we are seeing that happen, and fantastic that commitments are being announced. And I know I'm going to move to Kanika, who's going to talk about the fact that announcing commitments is not enough. They need to be measured, and if they're not measured, they will not be done. And I couldn't agree with you more, Kanika. I think as far as nations are concerned, as far as the private sector is concerned, as far as the civil society is concerned, I think everything needs to be measured. If it is not measured, it is not going to be done. So with respect to what we are committing to, what are your views, and how do you think the summit is going to be able to, accelerate that?
Yeah, thank you, Vaishali, and thank you actually for even hosting this conversation, because the focus on COP is really important, as you identified, but often what tends to happen at these climate negotiations is, from my point of view, a lot of grandstanding, a lot of long-term commitments are made by those who are not necessarily going to be in the position that they currently hold in 2050 or 2060 when it's time to be accountable for those goals. Which is not to say that the target setting is not important. I think India's renewable energy sector is a really good example of what strong, very clear, simple, long-term target setting can do, because it's like an advanced market signal of sorts, right? So to say, this is where we're going to get. And the net zero targets that today, to be honest, there are very few very large kind of companies that don't have a net zero target. There's lots of countries that have net zero deep decarbonization targets, either for 2050 or for in some decade following 2050. But I'm really curious to know, how are they going to get there? And that seems to be a bit of a secret, because no one really has a roadmap or a plan that they're willing to share, which is why Shalabh's point around this kind of phased approach of investments being Paris aligned, and what is the definition of Paris aligned and things like that, is actually the exact kind of leadership that the world needs. And there is a lot of momentum, as Anita was saying, especially we're even seeing in the Indian financial institution context with federal banks' big announcement to make no new coal investment. It's game changing, and it really shows how the economics is shifting. And I think that is what is needed for scale. But what I'm particularly focused on and hopeful about at the upcoming COP is to say, how do you take your long-term goals and break that down into a set of actions that you can commit to for the coming 10 years? As everyone has already identified, the sector is really dynamic. I mean, all the clean energy sectors, there's a lot of technological evolution, there's a lot of evolution in financing mechanisms and business models, etc. But we can still make commitments for 2023, 24, 25, all the way to 2030. Because if we don't, some of the net zero targets will mean action begins in 2045, because we are hoping that there will be some kind of magic bullet that will come up between now and then. And what that means is that we're actually going to exacerbate the problem before we solve it. So I would actually just say, kind of as exactly, your session is titled, how do we move to action? One of the mechanisms that we're promoting at UN Energy is that of the energy compacts. Of course, climate is broader than just energy, but within the largest contributor to emissions, one of the things that we request all governments as well as private sector development partners and everyone else to do is put forward what are the specific actions that they can do. And the reason for that is actions can be partnered on, actions can be emulated, even as transition pathways differ for different sectors, different countries, different regions. So I'd be happy to talk a bit more about the energy compacts, which are the specific set of actions, but even just beyond the compacts to say, can we focus on what we're going to do rather than kind of the grand narrative of what is required. I think the science.
Yes, thanks for making that point, and thanks for emphasizing and underscoring the fact that we need to showcase some of the ways in which we can actually measure the change as IFC is aligning with the Paris alignments, etc., and what SE for All is doing with respect to the compacts. I hope there's going to be enough showcasing and advocacy at the summit so that those who are not really doing it in this way and are making these grand commitments without really knowing how to get there can perhaps learn a little bit as they step back to their own geographies. And that's quite important. And talking about geography, Shalabh, I know you have a hot stop, so I'll just come back to you with a follow-up before I go take the full round. That, the emerging nations have been pointing fingers a little bit, historically towards the larger emitters in the developed world, and saying that the latter should bear a fair share of the decarbonization goals. And so there is this thorny situation between the North and the South. How do institutions like you see this as a situation? And is there a consensus to be able to bend the curve where it's required, and how?
Okay, I think as I mentioned earlier, IFC and the World Bank is not involved in the geopolitics of the whole and the whole dynamics. But at the same time, we are absolutely committed to working in each emerging country and looking at the local problems there and trying to find mechanisms. Sometimes there is concessional and donor financing available for smaller countries beyond just a North-South trade. So, for example, in the countries that we look at in South Asia, which is part of my domain, there are smaller countries like Nepal. Bangladesh is no longer a small country, but still much smaller than India, and then Sri Lanka and Maldives and so on. And what we have found over the last 1 year, 2 years, there's a lot of donor and concessional financing available for climate. In fact, when we went out looking for donor fund, the easiest way to get it was for actually ask for climate. And we were able to raise much more than we can actually deploy in a sustainable manner. The challenge is to actually put together business models, put together governance structures, put together a proper roadmap so that even this concessionality can be clearly identified, can be clearly deployed. And that would mean working with the governments in capacity building, both at the national government, at the local government. That would mean working with the private sector to make sure that they actually put together a business plan. I think no free money can solve the problem if it is not clearly deployed in an identifiable project which leads to benefit. If that roadmap is clear, I think funds will slowly start coming. And you can see the example of India and no better person to talk about it than Anita, and maybe I'll ask her to chip in. When she was part of us in 2008, we financed the first renewable energy project, or at least in India, which was Azure. And we started off by actually looking at concessional financing just before that to show it as a demonstrable project. And today, financing is not an issue as far as renewable in India is concerned. There are whole host of other issues, like you need to develop diversified sources of funding, capital markets, green bond market, and so on. And there have been many issuances there. So I don't want to get into the north-south politics of it, but I think there's a lot of work to be done at the ground level to attract capital. There is a lot of capital available, and it will come to the place which has all the right structures to attract it. Maybe, I don't know whether Anita wants to jump in here. Thanks.
Anita, do you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Shalabh. I think what I totally agree with what you say in that capital is not the constraint. And I can speak to CDPQ as well. Back in 2017, we came out with targets, and this also speaks to Kanika's point. And these were not like 5 years from now or 10 years from now, but these were annual. And one of the things we did was to link our remuneration to achieving those targets. That has had such an amazing impact that we are now able to up those targets for the next 5 years. And CDPQ is not alone. In fact, one of the things we did was to play the stewardship role of saying to all the other Canadian pension funds, as well as long-term institutional investors, to come together and really make these commitments, disclose performance in terms of achieving those targets, and have those verified. Now, coming to the point that Shalabh raised of this capital that's there and where the commitments are there, we are looking globally for investments that are bankable, as they would say. So wherever we can find these investments, I think there would be appetite. A big role that I see for IFC and World Bank is really that catalytic role. And currently we are working alongside the IMF, World Bank, Rockefeller Foundation to mobilize institutional capital into these different areas, including, I think, Shalabh, what you mentioned earlier, of the more difficult, high-emitting sectors. So helping them to achieve transition, which I think is as important as building new green investments.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you, Shalabh. And both of you raise a very important point. I think institutions such as IFC, World Bank also have a very important role to play to direct innovative financing to the social sector, because who else will do it? And there is huge amount of opportunity from a climate perspective to address the challenges which people are facing in that segment. I'm not sure how much funds are actually going there vis-a-vis the amount which are required to bring about the change and to mitigate the impact of climate change. Also, the point on bureaucracy, capacity building is a brilliant one. And as I mentioned, we've been speaking to various representatives across the globe, like in the US, in Europe, etc. And everybody's keen on this cross-national collaboration to learn from each other, but it's not happening. We are keen to see that happen. It would be great if our technocrats and bureaucrats get some inputs from, let's say, other states in the United States or other countries in Europe, and vice versa, where we can share our learnings in other parts of the world as well. Somehow we need to facilitate that, and perhaps another panel to discuss that. But thank you for those fantastic comments. Jyoti, thank you so much for being here with us today. And while Shalabh very politely did not address the question on the bit of issue around the north-south sort of quibble we see. Would you have any, point to make there as a journalist? I guess it's easier to do that. So I'm wondering if you feel that this issue between emerging nations and developed world, to meet their respective decarbonization goals, can get a fair sort of twist in the journey so that, the transition is a fair one.
Yeah, one thing positive I would like to begin with, and then get on to the issues which are there, is the coming back of the United States. The earlier regime, where we had seen that they had completely taken their hands off and rather questioned the need for any kind of funding towards climate change. At least this regime is more open to helping the other side of the globe. Now, this can, of course, just be a starting point. So what the developed world, or the North, so-called North, is trying to insist on countries like India, China, bringing down their carbon footprint, which at one level is correct, in the sense that we are starting off, we are at a better position probably to handle these challenges, because we are just bringing power to a lot of our population. So it's a new kind of a beginning we are making. And whenever we are somebody is making a new beginning, it can be a more environment friendly beginning than having legacy issues. But at the same time, it is unfair because of the per capita energy consumption, and to impose a heavy responsibility on a country like India, which nowadays is making headlines for shortfall in power and all that power because of the dirty coal. So it is, if the North insist on putting the entire responsibility on countries like India, then what happens is we are being very unrealistic in the approach towards handling this whole issue. Of course, a large part of this climate impact has been because of developed world and the lifestyle, or the industrialization level of industrialization these countries have. So in India, even if it gets very cold or very hot, there is a large section of the population which does not use air conditioning, which lives in a more environment friendly way, which rather walks than taking petrol or diesel cars, because simply because they can't afford it. And when it comes to, say, in air conditioning, it is also because of the power shortages which are there in the system right now, more acute. But it is there always, especially in villages, smaller towns. In bigger cities, of course, there are backups, but in smaller towns and villages, it is not there. So to put the blame entirely, or rather the responsibility entirely, on countries like India would be unfair. So in that sense, I would say that more needs to be done from the starting point of US getting into the COP again. And the financing which was committed earlier should be adhered, or rather increased, because the challenges are more now, and a swifter action would be required. So that is what I would say. Of course, on a company to company basis, there are lots of collaborations happening. We are hearing even your company went and listed abroad, and listed in US, and of course, so those kind of company to company collaborations, or the adherence to certain standards would come. But at the government to government level, the technology support, the overall commitments which are needed, needs a very realistic approach towards the whole issue.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jyoti. I think all good points, and thanks for your candid response on that. Just one more follow-up, with respect to commitments and with respect to what needs to be done, even in countries. From your experience, what role can COP26 Summit play in getting countries perhaps to consider accelerating their commitment to divestment in legacy energy systems? Is that a possibility? Is that a realistic hope?
Of course, a large chunk of India, even US, and even in China, the power is generated through the legacy coal, and nowhere in near future we can see it going. Though the share of renewable has increased, but at the same time, at the current situation in India and China, would tell you that coal still plays a very important role in power generation. So if we are talking about legacy in terms of coal-based generation, there are two ways of handling it. One, of course, is what India has already started to do and as China has also done, is bringing in the share of renewable, more and more renewable generation capacity is being put up. And even private and public sector companies, large power generators like NTPC, and in the private sector like Tata Power have said they will not put up more coal-based power. So that's one way of dealing with the legacy issue. The other way of dealing is that the capacity which is already installed and which the current situation, the power prices both in India and China have exposed that you cannot do without coal at the moment. That how do you handle those capacity or that coal requirement which is there in the system already? So, of course, technology is one way of making coal more and more benign and slowly phasing it out, as in phasing out the old plants, whether through retrofitment or whether retiring the plants altogether and putting up some renewable energy generation or some other form of cleaner power generation in those same premises. Land is a scarce resource in India, and therefore the existing power plants which are nearing the end of life or have already reached the end of their life could make way for greener projects. And a lot of companies are saying they would do that. So in that sense, there are two ways of handling it: increasing the share of renewables as well as slowly and efficiently phasing out coal-based generation.
Thank you, Jyoti. And absolutely, switching on the green switch gradually and transitioning is something I think people have had enough time to do it. There is still time. We just need to accelerate it and commit to it. It's easier said on conversations and discussions like this, but when we get down to business, there's so much more, right? There's the politics of it and so many other things we have to also look at. And perhaps, capacity building, which we spoke about at all levels, will help us think about the bigger picture and help us zoom out of just the smaller issues versus the larger issue, which will benefit. As we say, the easiest way I find of saying it is think about our next generation and what are we leaving for them. And I think that gets you. And if you have kids, I think it's just easier for you to take those steps in that direction. It helps, I think. Thanks a lot, Jyoti. Gauri, last but not the least in the first round, I just wanted to ask you, do you believe that acceleration of clean energy deployment and commitments by countries, especially in the context of their NDCs, as per the Paris Agreement, have been effective? How can India use COP26 platform, if at all, to act as a leader for other developing nations? And we've been talking about the whole Global South, and perhaps this feeds into that a little bit.
Sure. Thank you, Vaishali. Thank you for inviting me to this August panel. It's been a very rich discussion. I think, when we look at all the NDC commitments, they still leave a lot lacking, I think. When we look at all the net zero ambitions that are happening right now, what we see is they span about 191 geographies. The net zero goals come up to about 136, and those constitute still only about 72% of global emissions. And then when you go down to the next level, which like Kanika had also pointed out earlier, what's the roadmap? What's the plan? The goals with long-term plans, if you start looking, is about 34 countries which only constitute 18% of global emissions. And then if you start looking at the legally binding goals, those are only about 14 countries with about 9, which constitute only 9% of global emissions. So, there is a lot which still needs to be done. And I think when you ask about the India question, I mean, we, our NDC targets may be more achievable. We're, of course, a country which is not enunciated yet a net zero ambition. And I think there is some level of pressure to, give some kind of guidance on that net zero. What does net zero look like for India? When will it be? It'll be 2050, 2060, 2070. So I think that is one thing the world waits to hear from India. I do think, though, that India comes to Glasgow in some senses from a very unique position because, there is a huge potential to make a difference to emissions. And when I say that, I mean that there are structural challenges in the primary energy mix, like Jyoti also mentioned, the coal stock. When will that coal stock really get turned over? When will renewables be, sufficient to sort of overtake this base load issue of thermal generation? On the other hand, we see that, if you look at a map of India and you look at all the emission clusters in India, India has a wide distribution of emission clusters. And, there are material technologies that can be applied to those wide emission clusters, like carbon capture technologies. What is the linkage to hydrogen? Can we at least start with blue hydrogen? Can we at least get onto the hydrogen bandwagon, right? Also, India, I think, goes into Glasgow being one of the world's leading sources of carbon offset project locations. Now, I know carbon offsets is one of those very controversial things going in with Article 6, and also, there's the whole accounting issue, but the reality is we are one of the leading sources of carbon offset locations because of renewable projects. So how can we leverage those chips that we have, high emission clusters, leading source of carbon offset project locations, ambitions to be a global green hydrogen hub, and actually we have the elements for that, right? We have some of the world's leading refining capacity. We have a declared ambition of 450 gigawatts. We're well on that way. You are a big part of that story to get to 450 gigawatts. And we have the right elements, but it's about how to use those chips, those bargaining chips that we have.
Great, no, well said. And a bit of poker coming in there. And that's what it's all about. So Las Vegas on a global scale happening here, and we really have to just, I guess, play with more commitment here. And that is on a lighter note. Thanks a lot. As we come to the end of our first round of questions, I would like to request the audiences that they can type their questions and for any of the panelists, and we will take them up at the end of the session. So I'm doing a quick time check. We're not doing badly. Shalabh, I know you have a few minutes before you have to leave. So I'm going to ask you a fun question. And I always like to have these fun parts to these conversations, right? We don't have to take them that seriously. So if you are at Glasgow, day one of the summit, what is the headline you want to see in the Financial Times, which will make you feel that looks like it's a good start?
A check signed for just transition in any one country, for any one country. That's what comes to my mind.
That was a good one. Thanks a lot, Shalabh. And thank you so much. I'd love to kind of get you involved in another round of questions, but I understand you have to leave, but do stay on till as long as you can. And, once again, I'd like to thank you for joining. I want to come now to perhaps let's see. Let me go to Kanika. Kanika, we started the positive note, and let's move to a little bit of, criticism around some of these climate summits. Some of the issues are, and I know you've talked about it, that they're very long-term focused, they're far too distant in the horizon, and a lot of very incremental steps are being taken. do you see that this COP, I mean, I feel like I have seen a lot more action by leaders and a lot more commitment over the last few months for sure, and perhaps a few years. Do you see that there has been a meaningful correction, and would you go in with higher hopes and expectations coming out of this one?
So thank you, Vaishali, for that question, and also just for this really engaging discussion. I think, you know, because this is something that there's been so many discussions around, to still have new and unique perspectives come up is always so refreshing. So I'm really glad to be a part of this conversation. But just in terms of kind of being hopeful, I think we all go into COP26 hopeful because, as you said right at the start, we don't have a choice. If you go in cynical, what's going to happen, right? I mean, I think that there's kind of the realistic voice in your head that will tell you that no one summit is going to shift the game. But having said that, it is still really important to go in and say, what is the best that we can do? And I think that there has been a lot of, work that has gone into the preparation of the summit, including kind of the focus on the energy transition, where the COP26 unit has run the Energy Transition Council and campaign, which is to support 17 countries in the global south and try to make a country offer to each of them that helps advance their energy transition. But I want to touch on something Jyoti said before about kind of the burden on developing versus developed countries, right? And while I 100% agree with kind of the principle of differentiated responsibility because we didn't cause this problem as much as someone else, it's also important to think about the differentiated pathways that must come for the future. I mean, if there is a part of India's population that does not use cooling or heating, that does not use transport, does not mean that they should not use it. And I think it's important to recognize that economic development and sustainability is a false trade-off that the world presents to us. And if we continue to think along those pathways, we're not really making any compelling case for developing countries to make that transition in an accelerated manner. Just to share, like for context, I read this great statistic, and today with the IEA's energy outlook coming out, it's a good day to talk statistics. Is that 15% of global energy investment, not just clean energy investment, all global energy investment goes into countries that have 40% of the world's population. So this is kind of the developing world with 40% of the world's population only gets 15% of global energy investment, whereas developed countries that have 15% of the world's population gets 40%. So it's kind of the corollary of it, right? And despite the big shifts and the big strides that have been made, we're still continuing. It's kind of, the bankability point is like everyone wants to do green projects. They just want to do it off the coast of the UK or Denmark or wherever else. How do you get them to do it off the coast of, Sri Lanka or in Nepal, as Shalabh was talking about before? So I think that there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that space to think about how do you make what is currently at the margin a mainstream play for financial institutions. The second piece is to talk about energy demand overall. And this is which goes back to Jyoti's point, right? So energy demand in developing countries has doubled in the last 15 years, and it's going to grow by another 30% in the coming 15 years. And this is kind of accounting for a lot of energy efficiency in that demand projections. If the big negotiations at COP don't yield results, you're locking in this growing energy demand to come from fossil fuels. And in order for that pivot to happen, because you can't tell countries not to grow. I mean, that is in violation of a lot of other SDGs and other globally agreed upon commitments. So for the Paris Agreement to therefore be aligned with other global commitments, it must then say, here are the incentives for you to still grow, but on a clean energy pathway. Here is kind of, the financial package, here is the technology package. And like I said, there's a lot of grandstanding. There are countries, just by way of example, the UK as the host and current champion of climate action has 38% of its energy mix coming from gas. and currently has a gas shortage, which they should, and they are very worried about and should be very worried about. Nigeria also has 30% of its energy mix from gas. But one country seems to be in a position to espouse great values of sustainability to another country, whereas the country espousing those values has many more resources at its disposal as compared to Nigeria, right? So I think that there is a certain level of hypocrisy that will have to be addressed at COP26 for it to be of any consequence. And really, as you said right at the start, Vaishali, we're coming to the end of the line of where we can still have hope. Mm-hmm. So I think we're going to have to act on all of this quite quickly.
The two H's, hypocrisy and hope. Let's, I hope we can sort of take it down to just one H, which is hope. And I think that's where we rest our case. Thanks a lot, Kanika, for those brilliant points as always. Jyoti, let's just come back to you a little bit. It's and this is around decarbonisation. It cannot clearly be the government's sole responsibility. The private sector must chip in. Where do you think this is, especially in India, is there enough being done? Can we do more? I mean, you have a bird's eye view, given you, write in the papers every day and collect stories. What do you see?
See, as someone just mentioned, India, from the government side, we have not really come out with a net zero target officially, though the government is trying to promote more environment-friendly power generation at least. But if you look at the corporate side, the private sector side, or even that for that matter, the public sector undertaking side, a lot of companies have announced their net zero ambitions. Now, the thing is, these are not just multinational companies, non-Indian companies, but also Indian companies who are talking about net zero. So they have targets like 2030, some companies have 2040, but largely they have done this on their own out of their... Now, there are two sides to this. One, of course, there's a growing environment awareness companies want to be more environment friendly. And at the other side of it, it's a completely business logic to it. And that is the ESG funding, which is not available to companies if the scores go down, if they don't do these kind of things. So what I'm trying to say is that even if the government has not declared any official target of 2030, 2040 or whatever, the companies on their own are doing it. So, and a large number of these companies are very high polluting and are into very high polluting manufacturing or power generation. So there are automobile companies, there are power generators who have given their commitment to net zero carbon. Now, my only issue is that if the government, which I have earlier also spoken to some people about this, that if government just sets a target, and if government just does some public awareness kind of campaigns, governments do campaigns like the No Plastic campaign PCRA has done, or so similarly, if government moves and creates more awareness for common people. Companies understand these things. They have resources to understand, make their staff understand. They can hold workshops. But for at the individual household level, or the individuals who are not very well aware or well connected to these issues, who are jostling with their daily bread and butter, for whom sustainability comes later, but making a living comes first, to create awareness among this section of the population, which is also trying to grow economically, like Kanika mentioned, sustainability and economic development can go hand in hand. So if a person is aspiring a higher standard of living, he can still be environment friendly, still reduce his carbon footprint. Now, that kind of awareness only governments can, do. Companies do awareness campaigns, but that is very limited. So government has that wherewithal to do it in a much more, implemented implementable and meaningful way. So that's one thing. That's what I feel government needs to do. That's the only thing rather they need to do. And of course, if they could probably give some sort of incentives, for smaller SMEs, to move towards net carbon zero way of functioning. So SMEs need that support, which governments could do with some kind of incentives or stricter, oversight. But which is where I find in India at least, which is where I find there is no discussion around those things. So this is something which government needs to discuss at this point. Otherwise, everything can be left into the hands of companies and individuals.
Sure. No, thanks. All good points. And the fact is that, and I will come to Anita, that the financial and the investor community has been a great catalyst in this whole movement, in this whole transition. And the private sector chases funds and will do whatever it takes to get more. And so I think they have played, and thank you to all the investors who have really focused on really sort of supporting businesses which are showing their commitments. And I know Kanika is going to be thinking, yes, we are all going to, the private sector is going to show all these great numbers and show us the garden pathway, but I want to come and check it out year on year and see how you're doing. And if and so we need that sort of a master in the classroom with a bit of a ruler to see, guys, show me your knuckles and let's just get it right. And honestly, I think the last year or last couple of years has been about making these grandiose announcements. I think we want to make sure that the next couple of years is about reporting on them year on year. And if we make that a priority and if we get rewarded for doing that, I'm sure we'll be accelerating a little bit in the right direction. Anita, I want to come to you next and ask you that, you've got such rich experience across so many years and across so many opportunities you've probably assessed. Is there, one or a couple which you can talk about, which have been impressive in terms of just, I guess, justifying all the research and the work we do to put our dollars the right place? Any stories you want to, any examples you want to share, perhaps from India, which you feel is like really sort of, struck the chord in the best possible way?
Thank you, Vaishali, for the opportunity to talk about that. And actually, Shalabh mentioned already when India was at the stage of the first megawatt of private commercial solar. And this is 2008, 2009, when solar was really an emerging technology. And especially in India, we didn't have the complete regulatory framework in place either. And I remember chairing the investment committee for that investment and having to overrule very learned folks in our team just by saying that, look, if we don't try this and if we don't put our money behind this, we are never going to learn. And actually, the focus of that first investment was really about learning more about this sector and doing that by doing. Fortunately, I had the advantage or the privilege of investing again in that same company at 1,000 megawatts when I joined CDPQ. We came in as investors into Azure once again. And by then, the story of the sector itself had changed. The regulatory framework had become more established. Not to say that there are not challenges, which you know better than me. There are still a lot of challenges, but I think that's the kind of story which makes me believe that there is a lot that is possible. And one thing that I would love to say, which addresses a lot of the things that Kanika and Jyoti and Gauri also mentioned earlier, is the power of technology. I think India, for example, is very well positioned to take advantage of the power of technology in carbon capture and storage, in converting coal gas, synthetic gas, into green hydrogen, in using IoT and all our sort of deep tech and AI knowledge to promote energy efficiency, which is again a very, very important aspect. You know, one of the things that I learned was that even in countries where energy access is very low, energy inefficiency is very high. And that's something, again, that needs to be addressed. And I feel that we are very well placed in India and in the developing world because we don't have an incumbent technology. So it's easier relatively to bring in new technologies. So that's one thing that I would really push. Also, in terms of addressing the needs of SMEs and more on an individual distributed level, I think looking at new models of distributed energy, which we see already taking place in Europe, for example, is something that we should pursue. And that these are areas where the government can really incentivize, promote, and also from a global perspective, I think if we have to ask, those are the questions that we should really be asking for is state-of-the-art technologies that can help us address legacy sectors and the coal sector in particular.
Great, thanks. Definitely, I think digitalization is a great way to increase efficiencies, and all of this, I guess, feeds into the bottom line. As costs come down, you have to justify, and ensure that there is, the bottom line, which gets enhanced to get more funds, to show your IRRs and all of that. So clearly, I think technology is important. I'd also like to, all the new business development areas, business opportunities you've mentioned are there, but I think the power of people in India, the power of people who are educated, who speak the language, the power of women, if I could say, who are underutilized and not tapped enough because of the myth which exists about the barriers to entry in this sector, is something we all must work together. Jyoti, particularly you must write about the fact that this is not a sector which is only about being in the back of beyond to set up wind farms and solar farms and projects. It goes beyond that infra space. Even if that is an issue, I think we have young girls who would love to go and live on the sites, and companies are so willing to support that. We support such women.
Yeah, I have a small anecdote to share here as an energy writer and as an infrastructure writer for so many years and going to government ministries. I find that the number of bureaucrats or even in PSUs, the number of executives who are there taking decisions, framing policies for energy and infrastructure sector, you hardly find women there, even in bureaucracy, women are given ministries like health, women in child development, education. The hardcore infrastructure, energy ministries are not accessible to them. Now, whatever be the reason, if the women are not interested, I'm not too sure. But I think there is also a lot of maybe men are able to push their way into these high budget ministries. That could be one reason. But as far as the renewable sector is concerned, I think renewable sector is was following rather the same trajectory as in conventional energy. So that's why you find women missing there. But because of the decentralized nature of the renewable power, where you can have village level establishments as well, or a very small town can have a renewable power generation facility, I think it is easier for women, local women, to work in those establishments on the technical side as well as the finance and billing and commercial side of the business.
Sure. So thanks for that observation, Jyoti. The good news is that we do have a woman MD at SECI. So that's a role model we can all look up to. Hopefully, the first of many more to follow. So with that, what I'll do is I will take some, I have some questions here. And Gauri, maybe this I could direct to you. Continuing on our conversation around engaging women, obviously women are at the receiving end of climate, and especially in rural India, we do see a lot of that. You do a lot of research, what are your views on making this transition more inclusive, and how can we get more women engaged, not only at the panchayat level, as Jyoti pointed out, but I think across the spectrum. Any data which you have, which you could share with the audience?
Sure. So clearly, when 50% of the population is not engaged, we cannot have a just transition. And I think engagement happens in many forms. One is, as you said, at the village level, at the panchayat level. I mean, the whole aspect of energy choice. If we look at, one of my favorite examples is the Grameen Bank, right? It's not necessarily totally connected to this conversation, but how do you put the power of choice, of spending choice in the hands of the women? Because I think when women get the ability to choose where that money goes, I think decisions are made more in the interests of the overall family, the generations. I think that is one way. I think the other way is when we talk about the energy transition, one of the things that has happened in India is the whole movement from biomass to LPG. And I think that has given a lot of women time back, for them to be able to get maybe doing something else instead of just carrying wood to burn, right? So I think those types of stories also need to be brought out a lot more. That I think I saw one question come up which said, how can there be a just transition? How can the COP26 work for countries like India? I think that is where these stories have to be told. When people are asking India's net zero goal, that's a fair question. But at the same time, I think the story needs to be told that it's about renewables, it's about energy access. It is about cleaning, the biomass to LPG. We have made an energy transition from biomass to LPG. And at the same time, we're showing our leadership on renewables. These stories need to be amplified, and I think that voice of India from that inclusive perspective also has to come in, how women have been actually in some ways very central to it. If we even look at the Pehel scheme, the Ujjwala schemes, these are all very inclusive schemes. The only thing is we can't stop there, right? And I think that is where I really like this whole focus, which I see in the US on women in STEM. That how can women be brought into more of the STEM fields, and how can those women engineers, and maybe there should be a cohort of women engineers in India. I think it's so great to see the new chairperson of Engineers India Limited as a woman. So I think people like that, their stories should be told more. So I think that's where I would say that I think amplify the stories, because maybe there are too many myths still about women. Yeah. And I think the one thing fascinating to me about India is women in banking. Some of our most celebrated CEOs in banking have been women actually also. So I think I think those stories have to be told, amplified, and made models of.
Absolutely, I think very, very well put. I think more needs to be done, and all of us, I think, can play a role in doing that. In our own ways, by what we write, how we tell stories, how we showcase them, perhaps at the COP. We run a program. We are running a program with UNDP. It's a women's accelerator program where we're trying to fund women in partnership with other institutions. The program is being run out of our Center of Excellence at IIT Delhi, where we are inviting women to come up with solutions across the spectrum, around sustainability, on innovative solutions and entrepreneurship, on ideas which relate to the whole spectrum of sustainability. It could be
Okay.
to, circularity, renewables, software, technology, etc., etc. And so there's some amount of capacity building, funding, partnering, etc., which will hopefully help them advance. And that's an area which I feel very sad to see. Anita, it's great to have you as a woman leader in a funding organization, but unfortunately, whether it is because of a lack of leadership, women don't get easily funded in a lot of these areas. So that's a big problem. So if you could do, your bit to accelerate that, I think that'd be quite helpful. There's a question which is a very interesting one, which is come around, how can we source hard to get metals and minerals for green revolution? What's happening on the funding around that as well? Perhaps, I don't know if Anita or Kanika, you have any views on that? What can perhaps lithium, iron, etc. I mean, we know that storage is a big thing, but yeah, I mean, how is that going? Is there a lot of interest in that area?
Kanika, do you want to go ahead?
No, please go on. Please.
So it's very true. So 90% of demand for lithium now is for sort of the green sectors. And there is a lot of interest. In fact, a lot of countries are now taking a new focus on these. And it's not just lithium, there's cobalt, nickel, a lot of the metals and minerals that go into, cell phones, as well as EV vehicles, as well as storage. So there has been also a big push, which I had mentioned earlier as well, on the supply chain and the greening of the supply chain. So the mining practices in extracting these metals, how sustainable they are, how they are treating the people who work in these mines, etc., is becoming a very prominent issue. And again, for long-term investors like ourselves, that's something that we're looking into more and more, not just the end product, but what's the whole supply chain that gets us to that end product. Over to you, Kanika.
Yeah, Kanika, would you like to add?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that this is, again, also a space where governments must be proactive and must take a long-term view, even though I'm constantly talking about short-term actions, but they must, of course, be, on integrated energy planning is really important. And I think that one of India's great successes on the renewable energy side is perhaps slightly marred by some of the confusion, which is only now, of course, getting cleared up on the manufacturing side. And one of the reasons for that was because we didn't take necessarily an integrated view on the sector. And it's really important to now not just think about, manufacturing of panels and solar, but then to think, along the value chain on battery storage, on hydrogen, on, also thinking about like, how do you retrofit the gas network to use green hydrogen, especially since so much of India's gas network is currently being built or extended, right? So and how do you make kind of those wise investments that may be more expensive upfront, but actually will not result in stranded assets? So I think that the answer really is for government to take a long-term view, to sign long-term purchase agreements with countries that do actually have a lot of these resources. A lot of it has already been mopped up, to be honest, by many other countries. So we are already going to be playing catch up. But regardless, I think, it's still early days. It does offer us the opportunity to become, and I think, Gauri, you said this, that we're a very interesting position because we're a developing country that has one of the largest renewable energy markets. So we have a lot of experience. We've done a lot of innovation, including in the type of, bid design, solar plus storage, manufacturing linked tenders. So there's a lot of space for that kind of innovation. We're also a laboratory for the world for applications like solar pump sets and MSME applications of renewables. So I think that we need to kind of really use all of this to our advantage and negotiate some of these long-term contracts so that, and then leverage, institutions like the Solar Alliance to really then demonstrate our leadership for the whole world.
Great. Thank you so much, Kanika. I think I am 10 minutes over, and I know it's late here. Perhaps, Kanika, your day is beginning and you have meetings scheduled. So thank you for not interrupting and being patient. I'll wrap this up in a couple of minutes. But before I do that, I'd ask Shalabh a question, which was around the headline he'd like to see on the first day in the FT. If we go around, and if all of you could talk about your wish list for the headline you'd like to see on the last day, so that we know that it was a fruitful COP, and there is hope, the one H which should be left and without hypocrisy. So over to you. It's just fun, anything, and we could start with whoever wants to volunteer. For Anita, perhaps you could go first.
So I would say that I'm a great believer that net zero is net positive. And I think that recognition will do a lot of good for each and every country, that this is not a big sacrifice. It's actually doing what's best for each and every one of us.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Gauri?
Sure. I love that question, by the way. I think the headline I would like to see is that we have a plan for that $100 billion in financing that is required.
Thank you. I love that answer as well. Jyoti?
Yeah, I would love to see India and China saying that they will collaborate together for net zero and exchange their experience, because similar in many ways as far as energy transition is concerned, as far as energy accessibility is concerned.
Jyoti, you're brave. You're brave. Indo-China collaboration, way to go. I like that. And well, fingers crossed for all challenges. I mean, wherever there is a challenge, there's an opportunity, right? So let's hope the two countries can collaborate.
I think there is a lot of learning which two countries can have. Of course, we are always suspicious of China, but I think as far as energy transition is concerned, I think this, I'm sorry for coming back to the current shortages, but the current shortage of power and coal are some kind of an eye opener for both the countries who have been. China is adding the maximum capacity in renewable, in EVs, and India is also hoping to do that. So therefore, I think a joint just a vision or the strategy, even if not exchange of technology is better in West, but an exchange of strategy and vision is, I think, very important.
Absolutely. It's always good to push the envelope, and we need journalists like you who are going to do that for us. So thanks, Jyoti. Thanks for what you do. And Kanika, your headline.
I mean, I actually, to be honest, quite like all of the others, so I'll take any of them. But I guess it would be yours. But developed countries make a very kind of concrete clean energy offer to developing countries. So it's not just 100 billion to GCF, but it is what is each country going to get? What is kind of the support going to be? A bit more granular than that. But before we end, Vaishali, your headline.
You can guess, Kanika, you know me well enough. You know what I'm going to say. and I'm going to say that because inclusive. I want to see this transition to be an inclusive one, and tell me what you did, right? And what did you ask others to do? So I want to see that and all of what you all said. And all of your statements were so reflective of the comments you made in this conversation. So, I mean, it was really great, government to take a long-term view, short-term actions, capacity building, STEM programs for women, all the right messages coming out here. We'd be delighted to summarize these. I'm really looking forward to what happens next month. I'm going to be there, and hopefully I'll see some of you there, meet and, do our bit to make sure that our voice gets heard, loud or soft, but it must get heard. Thank you so much. Thank you for staying on for 15 minutes. I love meeting all of you, and thanks once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishali.
It's great to see you all. Thank you, Vishali.
Bye.